Hello and welcome to my video. In this video, I'm going to tell you the complete story of the writing of Silent Night, the world's most popular Christmas carol. I'll tell you who wrote it, where it was written, when was it written. I'll tell you the background behind why it was written, and I'll explain how it became the most popular carol in the world. My story starts in this beautiful village. This is what it looks like. It is called the sunniest place in Austria. Now, this time of the year, it looks more like this. And the name of this village is Mariafar, Austria. And the year was 1815. There was a church, and it was called Our Lady, the Mother of Consolation. And a newly ordained 23-year-old priest by the name of Father Joseph Mohr was assigned as a pastor to this church in 1815. Now, the Napoleonic Wars had been going on for the last 12 years throughout Europe. And 376,000 Austrians had been killed in battle, more than any other country in Europe. In fact, 24% of the entire male Austrian population had been killed in the Napoleonic Wars. If that were America today, that would have been 36 million men killed in America to equal the loss to Austria. A staggering. The Battle of Waterloo was fought over 2 days in June of 1815, and 50,000 men died, and of those, once again, 5,700 were Austrians. Furthermore, there was a volcano in 1816 called Mount Tambora in Indonesia. This is one of the worst volcano eruptions in 10,000 years, and it put up so much smoke and ash into the atmosphere that the sun was blocked out around the world. And in fact, 1816 is known as the year without summer, because it was so cold and dark that crops could not grow, and thousands of people starved of starvation in 1816. And in 1816, Father Joseph Mohr wrote a poem titled Silent Night. And he put it away, and he didn't tell anyone about it. 2 years later, in 1818, in the village of Oberndorf, Austria, which only had about 510 people, Father Mohr was transferred here. And he was transferred to this church, and this is an actual picture of the church. This is St. Nicholas in the little village of Oberndorf. And Father Mohr was transferred in 1818. Now, in 1818, there were these roving bands of actors and musicians that traveled throughout Europe, and they would put on plays. And one of these troops came to the little village of Oberndorf, and they were going to present the Christmas story. Unfortunately, the church was not available. Normally, something like this, especially a play about the Christmas story, would have been presented in the church in the village. But St. Nicholas had flooded because the church was right next to a river. And in the fall of that year, the river flooded and it damaged the organ. And so the organ was unplayable. Now, they needed an organ for this play, so they had to go find another location. Fortunately, there was a very rich family in the village, and they had an organ in their home. And so the play was put on in the home of this rich person. And of course, Father Mohr was invited to attend. As he was walking home that evening after the presentation, he looked out over the village and he saw something that must have looked like this. And he remembered his poem, Silent Night. And he decided right then and there that he wanted to take that poem and have it transcribed to music so that they could sing it in his church on Christmas Eve. But he wasn't a musician. Fortunately, he knew someone who was. Franz Xavier Gruber. He was the organist and the choir master at St. Nicholas. So Father Moore took his poem to Franz Gruber and asked him if he would write it and put it to music. Now, Franz Gruber knew that the organ was damaged and unplayable, so he composed Silent Night to be accompanied on the guitar because Father Moore could play the guitar. This is an actual copy in the handwriting of Father Moore made just a year or two later. It still exists today, so we know exactly what that song sounded like originally. And so Silent Night was performed for the very first time on Christmas Eve in St. Nicholas Church in 1818. And Father Moore played the guitar and he sang tenor, and Franz Gruber sang bass. So, how did this beautiful song, written by two unknown amateurs for a small little church in a tiny Austrian village, ever become the most popular Christmas carol of all time around the world? Here's the rest of the story. That organ that was damaged, it was probably one of these. It was a pump organ. And a man by the name of Karl Marcher had built the organ, and so he was called in to repair the organ in St. Nicholas Church. He came across the musical score for Silent Night, and he really liked it. And he asked Father Moore if he could show it to some friends of his, and these friends were the Rainier Folk Singers. Now, the Rainier Folk Singers were pretty famous throughout Europe, and they started singing Silent Night in 1819, and they traveled all over Europe. They sang for royalty. They sang for kings and queens and dukes and archdukes, and they sang for the Tsar of Russia. They were well known. So Silent Night started spreading throughout Europe. Stille Nacht, of course, it was sung in German. Now, the Rainier Folk Singers made a tour of America in 1839. The tour lasted 4 years. They went to Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and they went all the way out to St. Louis. 4 years they traveled around, and they were singing Silent Night. Of course, they were singing it in German. In New York City, they put on a concert in the Trinity Church, and this is the actual church. Now, the rector, who's the priest in charge, the rector of Trinity Church in 1839 was a man by the name of John Young. And so the Rainier singers came and they sang Silent Night, and he loved it. And he is the man who translated it into English a few years later. So that's how Silent Night came to America. Since then, Silent Night has been translated into over 140 languages around the world. During the terrible World War I trench warfare, there was a truce called on Christmas Eve in the year 1914. And the Germans and the French and the Americans and the British troops came up out of their trenches, and they came together in no man's land. And they exchanged cigarettes and cigars and pipe tobacco and liquor. And they decided to sing together. The only song that both nationalities knew was Silent Night. So the Germans sang it in German, and the English and the British and the Americans sang it in English. Silent Night, 1914. Christmas Eve of 1966 in the Gulf of Tonkin, 30 miles off the coast of North Vietnam, this aircraft carrier was cruising in those waters. It is the USS Enterprise, and I served aboard the USS Enterprise as a chief nuclear reactor officer. We were conducting 24-hour around-the-clock bombing raids against North Vietnam non-stop, day after day, week after week. But on midnight of Christmas Eve, the captain declared a temporary truce, and 3,000 of us gathered in the hangar bay. Now, the hangar bay was the size of 3 football fields, and we had a crew of almost 6,000 men. So half of us, 3,000 of us, gathered in the hangar bay, and we sang Silent Night. So here is that beautiful song, Silent Night. And I have performed it and recorded it with guitar. Merry Christmas, everyone.